I want to welcome all persons tonight, and I express again the team's gratitude for your participation these latter 4 weeks of January. I'm going to ask a total of 4 questions if we have time. But first, I want to present our distinguished panel in alphabetical order. So number 1 is Reverend Mark Baridon, who has stepped in at the last moment. Wayne Ganatic, the Reverend Wayne Ganatic, called at 8:30 this morning to tell me that he could hardly talk because of COVID. And his wife had it last week, so I was aware that that might happen. But I called Mark, and Mark graciously said yes. And my heart has been dancing all day. Mark was graduated from Louisville Seminary, formerly Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and for 21 years has been a co-pastor at Central Presbyterian Church in Louisville, the only congregation that has declared itself a reproductive freedom congregation through ARCRC. Before serving Central Press, I learned he was, and I think for 15 years, manager of pastoral care at Fairview Hospital, a UCC hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Welcome, Reverend Mark Baridon.
Thank you.
Raise your hand, Mark. Well, your name is on your square. So. The second is Cantor Sharon Hortis, who has served the Knesset Israel Temple Congregation as cantor since 2008, and she served as rabbi to the congregation during their recent search for a rabbi. Cantor Hortis performed at Mayor Greg Fisher's interfaith services, honoring both his inaugurations, and she has recorded her debut solo album of Ladino and traditional Sephardic music, Mi Corazón Sopira, in 2015. And she and her band, Transito, perform at a variety of venues throughout the Louisville area. And her CD is available at the Gift Gallery at Knesset Israel on Taylorsville Road, folks. Third is the Reverend Lauren Mayfield, a member of St. Andrew United Church of Christ, who has been for 5 years co-pastor at Highland Baptist Church in Louisville. Lauren received her Divinity, Master of Divinity at Fuller Seminary in Southern California, and is presently studying for her doctorate at the Pacific School of Religion, which I think is in Berkeley. Is that right, Lauren? Wonderful.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Reverend Mayfield has testified in Franklin, Kentucky on behalf of women's health issues, and with Planned Parenthood has been at the White House to testify and to meet last year at a roundtable discussion that included our Vice President, Kamala Harris. We welcome Lauren Mayfield. And finally, the Reverend Elwood Sturdivant served as pastor director of the Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church in Louisville, a congregation who has now changed its name to All People's Unitarian Universalist Congregation. Reverend Sturdivant was a member of the Concerned Clergy for Choice, which is where I met him 8 to 10 years ago. And now we serve together on the board of KRCRC, the Kentucky Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And I think you've been there 2 years, Elwood?
Thereabout, yep.
Yeah, and I've been there only a year. So let us get on to the first question. And I am going to go in the order of Lauren first, then Sharon, then Mark, and then Elwood. When and how did you first become interested in reproductive justice? And how has that initial interest expanded to where you are today? Lauren?
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Diane, for that lovely introduction and for including me in this panel conversation tonight. I've really been looking forward to it. It's important work, it's important dialogue, and I'm really glad that you and St. Andrew are doing this. So thank you. I first became involved in reproductive rights when I moved to Louisville with my family nearly 10 years ago now. My husband and I met in undergrad school in Alabama, and then we jumped all around the country while we were in grad school and post-grad school work, and then came to Louisville. And one of the stops, one of the geographic stops along our journey was New Haven, Connecticut. And when we lived in New Haven, we lived directly across the street from a Planned Parenthood health center. And every Saturday morning, when individuals were going to Planned Parenthood for reproductive care, so also were the picketers and the pro-life protesters out there on the street corner holding deplorable signage and shouting offensive, insulting, undignified things to the folks who were going into the health center. And so that was, I had always heard that this was a reality for people, but to live across the street from it and see it every single weekend for an extended period of time was awful. And so when we moved to Louisville, I knew that I wanted to get, when we were going to be here for a while, we were planning our roots, we were going to raise our kids here, we had settled on these things. And so I knew that I was ready to invest my time in my energy into connecting with the reproductive rights community here in Kentucky. So one of the things that also contributed to this journey for me was in undergrad, I minored in Christian women's leadership. And I grew up just with all kinds of privileges. It's kind of absurd. And so it wasn't until I was in college that I was awakened to so many things, like we all are in college, right? Go ahead and give me a thumbs up or a nod if that was true for you. Yes, thank you. And in this work and learning about first and second and third wave feminism and women's liberation and equal initiatives that were happening or not happening all around the country, that was when it first started to arise for me, this migration and merger of my faith and my politic. And I started to realize that one could inform the other, and that my faith didn't have to preclude my political action, or my political action did not have to ignore my faith, that those two can work together. And as I continued to move around the country and encounter different people and different people groups and ways of being in the world, and all the different ways that we take up space and the questions that we ask and the ways that we don't need to apologize for who and what we are or what our needs are, I learned and started to grow really angry about politicians who seek to legislate morality. I just don't think that works. And so, as that is such a common thing when it comes to trying to legislate how women in particular, but especially trans people and non-binary people and queer folk, politicians are all about trying to legislate how we use our bodies or don't use our bodies. The idea of choice and autonomy and agency became very important in my own advocacy work.
Thank you, Lauren, very, very much. Does anyone have a question for Lauren or need clarification of anything that she said, which seemed mighty clear to me? All right, and let us hear from Sharon.
Thank you. I do really also appreciate being included in this dialogue. I think a lot of times when people talk about the religious views on reproductive choice and reproductive justice, the Jewish voice is not always a part of it. And we have a lot that has been written throughout the ages about this subject. And it's very different from the rhetoric that you may hear coming from the religious right. Even if they're using the same texts that we use in our study and in our worship, and in our theology, they're interpreted in a completely different way. So it's really nice to have a chance to get to vocalize this and get to share this. So to answer the first question, I've just been thinking about this. I spoke at my synagogue just this weekend, just Saturday morning, about this topic. And I went back in my mind. I thought, when did I start to get really interested? When was this issue? When did it become something that was on my radar? And I remember one of my best friends and her mother used to go to pro-choice rallies in Cincinnati, where I grew up. And I remember thinking that was just really cool. And I knew a little bit about it. You know, I was a teenager. It was like something that I had heard about, but I thought, wow, you know, they're going out there and they would tell us about the counter protesters and how ugly they would get. And it was really shocking. And I thought, wow, you know, this is something I'd like to be a part of. So I kind of filed it away. And later on, when I was in graduate school, I became really close friends with one of my neighbors, who was a single mom with some physical disabilities. And we became very close. And I would, you know, watch her daughter and take care of her from time to time. And then my friend had an unwanted pregnancy, and it became very dangerous. It was life-threatening for her. And she was able to, where we were living and at the time and place, was able to get a second trimester abortion. Had she not, I think she would have died a horrible death and left her daughter, young daughter, an orphan. And something that had been sort of an abstract idea for me. Of course, you know, I believe in the right of a woman's right to choose, but here was an example where it literally saved my friend's life. And so I got angry, I got involved. And then when I ultimately moved to Louisville, I had volunteered with the Kentucky Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And when Justice Kennedy retired, I joined the board because I thought I needed to do something concrete, even if it's, you know, showing up to meetings and volunteering and passing out pamphlets or speaking at various events. It was something that I could do because I felt very strongly about this. Again, circling back to what I had talked about initially, that my religious freedoms are impinged when other people try to claim to be exercising their religious freedoms. Judaism does not have a prohibition against terminating a pregnancy. It's very complicated, but we believe that life begins at the first breath and not at conception. I consider myself to be a religious person. I'm clergy. I obviously chose this lifestyle and this, you know, pursuit. And so I feel even more compelled to educate myself on what my religious traditions have to say about this subject, and to educate other people, and to make sure that texts that we share from the books of the prophets that have been used to justify controlling women's bodies are interpreted in a completely different way in my tradition. So I feel like that's important for me to get that word out.
And we do too. Thank you, Sharon, very much. Thank you. And Mark?
Well, when people ask me this, I have two haunting images in my head, and one is from high school. There was I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and there was a business family in town that ran a business on a main street, and their kids were always, and grandchildren were always outside playing around the business. One of their daughters was raped and became pregnant, and the family were extreme, sort of, they saw themselves as devout Christian. They made her carry that child to birth and raise him. on her own as a single mother. The child did not look anything like the rest of the family. And I remember driving by there a lot, their business, and seeing that boy playing outside and just thinking, and my parents had no opinion on termination other than they both worked in a hospital who did terminate, that where they would do termination. So it weren't really raised against it. But I remember my mother just saying how awful the parents were for that, and how depressed. And they told that daughter she could never get married. And so far as I know, she never did get married. Her life was raising that child. And I always thought, what a sad thing for parents to use their religion to make somebody do that. And then just a few years ago, in my office came a dear sweet grandfather in tears, and he said, I'm not a member here, but I need to talk to you about something. And his daughter-in-law was pregnant for the third time. They had 2 children, and the third pregnancy, if she carried the child to term, she would die probably because of some blood pressure and other issues. And so she was going to do that, but her devout Christian mother told her, you can't do it. You'll go to hell, and et cetera, et cetera. And this guy was in tears. He said, my grandchildren will not have a mother if this happens. So those are kind of 2 things when I think of those, how other people have forced this issue and how the tragedy I think it causes. But then also my own religious upbringing. I was raised in a neighborhood in Des Moines, like 2 blocks from a synagogue. A lot of my playmates were Jewish. And so when this, in my developing years, when these topics came up, Sharon, that's what we were taught in my church as well, that life begins when you take your first breath and it ends when you lose your breath. So there were a lot of end of life decision things we talked about as well. So that was very formative to me, and that's what I've thought and believed my life. But then, in studying scripture and being a pastor, and especially being a chaplain, where people would ask me to pray with them for decisions, they would pray and make a decision one way or another. And to me, it was like an insult to God almost to say, well, they prayed about it. Do you think God gave you the answer, and gave them a different one? I mean, I just don't understand that thinking when people pray about their medical treatment, how somebody else can say, oh, no, that wasn't what God wanted. It's mind blowing. So because of my belief in prayer and people having their own personal choice, and also being, a white man who's and has never been really poverty stricken, I just look at all the issues around that, around poverty, around some women really, I think, don't have a choice because of their poverty and other issues. And being gay, I certainly don't want people telling me what to do, and I don't want to be one that legislates that or throws. So this is what God wants for everybody, just because it's what I believe. So I think my whole childhood and up through adulthood, my idea of reproductive justice has been strengthened for all those reasons.
Thank you, Mark, very much. I forgot to ask after Sharon presented if anyone had a question specifically for Sharon in response to her responses. Okay, and what about Mark? Reverend Baridon. All right, then we're on to Reverend Elwood Sturdivant.
Oh, well, I'll join the rest of the panel in thanking you for including us. Thank you to St. Andrew for having us be part of this. This is a great thing that you and the church have done to provide this whole series for people. I'm old enough that when I was an undergraduate, we didn't have the Roe decision. I lived in California. California had adopted a stance that allowed abortion to be performed in the language of the day if there was a risk to the life of the mother. Wound up knowing a couple of young women on campus who got abortions. in my ignorance, thought that the risk to the mother created an excuse. People could say I was having suicidal thoughts. Shared this with the women, and they set me straight that they indeed had suicidal thoughts, that being forced to give birth, they thought would be an end to their life. And so, when they said that they had these thoughts, they meant it. That gave me an introduction to the significance of abortion that, as a young man, I hadn't understood. I went to seminary, after 10 years out in the world. By the time I went to seminary, the Unitarian Universalist Association had passed its Women in Religion resolution. This was 1977, called upon all Unitarian Universalists to carefully examine their own religious beliefs and to the extent to which those beliefs influenced sex role stereotypes within their own families and within the movement. That began to change in Unitarian Universalism. So by the time I was in the seminary in the early 80s, my class was half women. These days, more than half Unitarian Universalist clergy are women. So that certainly made a difference in how our whole movement appreciated things. I wound up interning at the First Unitarian Church of Dallas, in Dallas, Texas. That congregation turned out to have had a significant role in the Roe v. Wade decision. And so I met women there in 1986, 1987, who had been there back as early as 1969. The congregation had a women's alliance. It actually had two, a day alliance and an evening alliance. 1969, the alliance decided to study issues around feminism, but in particular to educate themselves on abortion procedures and laws. They brought in people from Planned Parenthood, doctors and lawyers. The people I talked to said they started to go regularly to lobby at the legislature, but after months and months of doing that, they began to give up on trying to make legislative change, Texas being what it was then and seems still to be, so that they began to look at what kind of legal challenge could happen. They met with an attorney, Linda Coffey, in 1970, who was a friend of the church. Linda Coffey introduced the women's group to Norma McCorvey, that we all know as Jane Roe. The other attorney involved in the case, who took the case to the Supreme Court, was supported by these women in the church. They developed a group, brought in some other women from the community, urged the bringing of the case, provided funding for it, and continued to support it, and take continued interest to this day in Roe as something that they had a big part in accomplishing. Wade was a Dallas figure, the Dallas district attorney. From what I read, he was actually shouldn't have been named. It should have been the attorney general for Texas, but the court didn't make the correction. Wade was actually pro-choice privately, but had to defend the law as it stood in Texas. There's an article in The Guardian that gives me some of the details around this. Over the decades, the church carried on the tradition of supporting reproductive rights. and continues to this day, so that the minister, Daniel Cantor, now has started a clergy group that was doing counseling at the local Planned Parenthood. They made sure that there was always a clergy person there until COVID came along. He's now started the clergy group that's trying to overturn the current Texas law. So my story is sort of this continuous awakening. I went to Dallas not expecting to be exposed to what was still talked about as reproductive rights rather than reproductive justice. Several of the women members of the congregation that I served here in Louisville had been on the Planned Parenthood board. So eventually they approached me about joining that board. I served for a couple of years before Planned Parenthood of Kentucky joined with Planned Parenthood of Indiana, served through that tradition and for a year or two afterwards. So it's been a while since I've been on the board, but that was yet another introduction to a lot of the realities of reproductive justice. Catholic hospital system had taken over University of Louisville Hospital during that time, and we were concerned about whether there'd be anywhere that would provide the kind of medical care that's necessary. From the Planned Parenthood board, I went to Clergy for Choice, and then to KRCRC, as you heard from Diane. So one thing after another. If we have time later on, I'll tell you about the Unitarian Universalist Association taking up reproductive justice as the overarching mantle, replacing just reproductive rights.
Oh, I can't wait to hear that. Thank you. Thank you. I think everyone here knows that it was the Unitarian Universalist and the United Church of Christ combined that produced the human sexuality education course for children and teens called Our Whole Lives. And that's the connection between the UUs and the UCCs. Thank you, Elwood. Does anyone have a question? All right. Question number 2, and some of you have come mighty close to your answer here. How does your faith stance, your conscience, your theology aid you in responding to the person who says abortion is murder and therefore against God's will? So in this case, we'll begin with Sharon. And we'll move to Mark, and then Elwood, and then Lauren. Cantor Sharon, unmute yourself and share with us.
I just did. Thank you. So, as I mentioned before, we don't believe life begins at conception, but at the same time, one of the first commandments in the Torah is to be fruitful and multiply. And that is a very important Jewish value. In fact, this past week, we read from the Torah, the section from Exodus, both a verse that talked about how sort of envisioning the most ideal world. They envisioned a world where women were never barren and never miscarried. So obviously this idea that it's important for women to bear children is there, but at the same time, there's the passage not too long afterwards that describes the situation if two men are fighting and a pregnant woman gets in the middle and a man strikes the pregnant woman by mistake and she miscarries, the penalty is not the same penalty as it would be for murder. It is a financial fee, that a punishment that the man has to pay. So we know right then and there, right in the very same section of the Torah, life is valuable, and to end a pregnancy is not murder. So I do often get the question many times when I'm volunteering at the KRCRC table at the Kentucky State Fair, how can you be religious and defend abortion? I think going in beyond, the Jewish stance, I look at what these other, it's mentioned 36 times in the Torah, in the Bible. You should look after the widow and the orphan and the people who can't take care of themselves, because that is what a society does. That's what we are not, it's not just a good idea, we are commanded to do it. And it's repeated 36 times in the 5 books of Moses. And when I think it was Elwood who brought up the idea that, or maybe Mark, that these women, pregnant people who are impoverished, who don't have access to the dwindling number of abortion clinics and other Planned Parenthood facilities, if the nearest one is miles and miles away, a day's drive, and you can't take a day off from your job, or you'll lose your job and lose your income, or if you have other children at home and you don't have adequate child care for those children, if your family is against what you're going to do and you don't have a means to get to where you need to go, you do not have the same access as somebody who has a more privileged experience of life. So you're neglecting one of the most important commandments of the Torah, of the Bible. You're not looking out for the least advantaged in our society. And in fact, you're putting more burdens on them and making their life harder, and not just their own lives, but the lives of their families and the children that they already have. So to me, I feel like that's kind of, if you're to rank the importance of these various commandments that were given throughout the scriptures, it's most important to look after people and help lift up people who have been born into poverty and who have been victims of injustice and systematic racism and systematic any kind of discrimination. So that's how I feel. My religious views inform my views on what I think needs to happen if somebody needs to terminate a pregnancy. And even the most traditional among the Jewish community, the Orthodox rabbis will very often, they may say, I have my personal beliefs, but I don't believe that it should be the law of the land. It should not be legislated. That politicians shouldn't decide what happens to a woman's body. It's a private decision. And whether they feel that, abortion on demand is not something that they would be okay with if the woman's life was not in danger. At the same time, there are Orthodox rabbis who will say if the woman's mental well-being is endangered, it's perfectly permissible to obtain an abortion. So a lot of different views out there, but as I mentioned, my personal view is that I am informed by my faith that what a woman or a pregnant person needs to do in order to live a fulfilling life, a genuine life, there should be no barriers between that person and reproductive health care.
Thank you, Sharon. Anyone have a response or a question? Then the next is Reverend Mark Baridon.
Well, to Cantor Sharon, my response would be amen, hallelujah. I agree totally. And that was a lot of my, I have a lot of the same similar thoughts on that and beliefs. I will say this past Sunday in our lectionary for our denomination, Jesus talks about release to the captives. It's something the prophet Isaiah talked about, and Jesus reiterates that. And to me, that's sort of a theme of if that's what we're called to do, is offer release to captives, among other things in that passage. But release is not judgment or condemnation. And one thing I learned a lot about, I think, when I was a chaplain is our hospital was constantly bombarded with protesters who would say that kind of stuff. How can you go in there with murderers? Or, well, you wouldn't believe this. Well, you would believe the stuff that was hurled at us. And my response always was, people in this, forced with these kind of decisions, need compassion. The last thing they need is your judgment. And if we're to give release to people, then that's release for justice, I think, and release for freedom of conscience. And as I said earlier, if people pray, then I'm not, the one to say, well, that they gave the wrong answer or something. So I think compassion and release are two of the guiding forces for me on these kind of decisions. And just for any, I just think legislating things because of my own faith is ridiculous. To make everybody else conform to what I have to believe in. I would never want to do that. And I resent people who do. Just a little sideline is, I've been told this by several people, well, you condone murder. Well, these same people, many of them believe in the Second Amendment right to carry a gun and tell me I would shoot somebody if they did this or the other. Well, isn't that murder? I mean, so it's okay if somebody's alive, and I try to present to people, if I can nicely, where do we have some common ground? I don't believe it's murder because of what what Candace Sharon said about it's just not biblical, I don't think, to believe in that. But also, where do we have common ground? There wouldn't be so many abortions if people could afford to have children. That's another part of it. If you can't afford to bring a child into the world and provide food and childcare, you've got a problem. So why don't we work on some of the poverty issues? Or why don't we work on some of the other social issues together, mental health and other things, and access to health care, and access to birth control that is proven to reduce the amount of abortion if you're opposed to it.
Thank you, Mark. You bring to mind what each week we have heard from one presenter or another, that reproductive justice includes the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the right to bring up a family in a healthy and safe environment. And you know that neighborhoods of poverty are not safe and healthy. So that's where your comments took me. Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment or a question for Reverend Baridon? Then Reverend Sturdivant.
Diane had an easier version of that question in one of her other emails to me. What would I respond to somebody who said I was going to go to hell for supporting abortion? And that's an easy question.
That's a good one.
Unitarian Universalist, in that the Universalist side of our tradition taught that God is love and that no one is condemned to eternal punishment. In fact, Universalists argued that it was an insult to the dignity of God to claim that God would act so unjustly as to punish a finite human sin infinitely. They taught that all people are the children of God, so that it's the human task to try and live as one loving family where everyone is regarded as a sibling to be cared for and not condemned. So the question in my tradition has never been what to do to avoid hell, but what to do that's best for the whole human family. That's not an easy question. We understand that people will come to different conclusions. Our tradition as a whole has adopted what we call the statement of conscience in favor of reproductive justice and abortion rights, but not all individual Unitarian Universalists would agree. Those who oppose abortion, in my experience at least, state that their opposition is personal, not societal, meaning that they can't imagine choosing to have an abortion themselves, but that they wouldn't try to make that choice for anyone else. We don't teach that there's one answer to the question of whether abortion should be chosen. We, in general, understand that a person has to come to their own answer, taking into consideration all of their circumstances. We might not agree with the decision that person makes, but it's their decision. We have come to use what we call our 7 principles as ways of trying to improve the practice of our own tradition. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And our 7th principle goes to respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we're a part. So in some ways, the principles move from the individual to the whole, and we understand that balancing those things is always a tricky problem. One of the principles, the 5th, talks about the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. We understand that one is actually paradoxical, as maybe the whole arc of the principles. So we have to do as best we can with them to learn how to live with them rather than just come to simple answers. The obvious paradox with the 5th principle, which talks about the right of conscience and the democratic process, is that sometimes individuals' conscience doesn't agree with what the democratic decision has been made. There's a story in our tradition that might be true. Henry David Thoreau objected to the Mexican-American War, and having refused to pay his taxes that he thought were supporting the war, was sent to jail. Supposedly, his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit him while he was in jail and asked, "Henry, what are you doing in jail?" And supposedly Thoreau turned around and responded, "Ralph, what are you doing out there?" You have the individual conscience and the decision of the society that we should be paying taxes, we should be going to war, that some of us remember from the Vietnam conflict going on. There isn't a simple one-size-fits-all answer. People have to make their own choices. That is the case for a lot of things in our world, and certainly for all the reasons that have been stated before. Abortion has got to be something where an informed person, with the assistance of the medical profession and their religious community and anybody else that they want to talk to, should make their own decision.
Thank you, Elwood. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Our congregation had a book study. I can't remember the name of the book. Theologian and author Philip Gulley. His most recent book is on universal salvation. And many of us pondered that for weeks or months following reading Reverend Gulley's book. All right, then we will go on to the 3rd question, which is just a very short answer. And that is, and everyone has made reference to people that are intimately affected by societal views, political views, church views on reproductive justice. So and our presenters in other weeks have given us by name many of the marginalized groups that are profoundly affected by the bans and restrictions to women's health care. So I would like each of our presenters to just try to name 1 or 2 marginalized groups that you know are affected by restrictions and bans on access to women's health care. And we will ask Elwood first.
Did Diane get to, or Diane, did Lauren get to answer the last question.
I didn't. Thank you, Elwood. Lauren, forgive me.
No worries. You're not going to let me off the hook, Elwood.
And no one else. Okay. Oh, Lauren. All right. How does your faith, how does your theology aid you in responding to the person who says that that abortion is murder, or that a person who chooses abortion will go to hell?
Yes. I don't say this to be sarcastic, and I don't say it tongue in cheek. I say it sincerely. I wish circumstances and things and matters of life were that clear cut. That if it's one or the other, it's this or it's that. I just don't think that life unfolds in that way. And as a follower of Jesus, I'm constantly trying to pay attention to how Jesus invites us into the nuances of life, away from the polarities and the binaries and into the messy, nitty-gritty middle where everyday life happens. And so in that way, I totally agree with my colleagues on the panel that I want to be having a different conversation than whether or not abortion is murder. I want to be having conversations about poverty and racism and homophobia. And I want to be having conversations about how God is mystery and God gives agency to God's people to make informed decisions, from everything about what they would like to eat to the health care that is most needed and most compassionate for them as they consider all of the concerns and issues that are before them. I want to talk about a God who believes in the movement of the Spirit, which is translated breath in the Hebrew Bible. I want to talk about how certitude and drawing lines in the sand squelches all of these characteristics of God. And to me, calling abortion is murder, is squelching the nuances and the intricacies of daily living. There's a wonderful physician who's also, I consider him a theologian. His name's Willie Parker, and he has written a wonderful resource on his life as an OBGYN who also offers abortion care. And the book is called Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice. And he concludes the book with a chapter that talks about a new theology of abortion. And in it, he unpacks the power of choice and the power of human dignity. And that when he is with a patient in an operating room getting ready to provide an abortion, that he feels like that's one of the holiest, most inner sanctum places he could be as a physician, holding that space with the patient, honoring their God-given right to make the choice of healthcare that's best for them, and to honor their personhood, and that there's nothing more holier than that. I'll close with one other quick theological story. It comes in the Gospel of John. It's in John chapter 8. And it's when the religious authorities and the social elite of the day have captured a woman in the act of adultery. And in first century Palestine, that was punishable by death. And so these leaders thought, aha, we've caught this woman. And so they throw her at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus turns the whole story up on end and says, who without sin may throw the first stone? Well, they don't throw any stones because we all have sin. And the point that I want to make is that, again, it's not that clear cut. And the woman in the story was disenfranchised and marginalized and oppressed. And Jesus saw through all of the systems that were disenfranchising and marginalizing and oppressing her, and sought to speak to the systemic nature of the issues and take it away from personal piety while still preserving the dignity of the individual. So anyway, that was a lot of words, but it's bigger than just one way or the other for me.
It was great. I loved your use of the words choice and dignity.
Mm.
So important, so important. Does anyone have a question for Lauren?
Yeah,
or a response?
I do, if I can ask a
Yes,
quick
David.
one. I'd be quick to know, first of all, I really appreciate all your answers. Thank you very much. The difficult area, and you've all been really helpful and thoughtful, so thank you. The question I have is, and it's a little bit off the topic, but not really. How do you think, or why do you think that abortion has become such a defining, all-consuming issue for conservative politicians and parties generally, and the religious right generally? It wasn't always so. In fact, it wasn't always so that the church, generally speaking, was even against abortion, but it certainly is now in traditional terms, shall we say. And it certainly has become I would argue, a sort of a central, all-consuming issue. And I'm just wondering if any of you have thoughts about how that happened.
Well, it works. Politicians are getting elected on it, so it works. So they're going to continue to do it. And I believe it's because people want to have control over something. And often in our culture, we feel like we don't have any control over our own life anymore. And that's one thing. I mean, I think it's wrong, but people want to control. And maybe that politicians have tapped into that desire for control, but it is working. And so I think that's why they'll continue to use it as long as it'll elect them, I think.
Thank you, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that, yes, Sharon.
Oh, so I think another element also is that if women can decide how many children they have or to not have children and choose to be in the workforce, that's threatening to a certain type of man who doesn't believe that women should be in the workforce. So it frees them up to take those positions and move out into the world, which is extremely threatening to a certain type of person. I also feel like socioeconomically, these people, who are born into poverty are going to take the jobs that nobody else wants, and these minimum wage jobs, and sort of service that underclass. And if you take that away and you limit the number of children that people in that socioeconomic rung are going to have, you're limiting the number of people who are going to be able to keep the people on the, who are more privileged, a more comfortable life, not having to pay as much for services and that sort of thing. So I can become very cynical when I think about that, but I do agree that that concept of control, right? We can't let women have too much. We can't let them have too much freedom, or what's going to happen. And I think that's really frightening. So, and many of them have convinced women that it's frightening for them to be out in the world. So if they have jumped on the bandwagon, and they've done a fabulous job of creating this fear and loathing of anyone who thinks that abortion is not murder.
Or that women are equal and should have equal rights.
Of course.
I have a cell phone summary that I have something that comes across my cell phone that is a summary of the New Yorker. And this week, when I was too busy to further investigate, there is an article in the recent issue of, I believe it's the New Yorker, it could be the Atlantic because I get both, but I think it's the New Yorker. It goes into the time when abortion was supported by Ronald Reagan, Pat Robertson, the conservative church, and very much supported. And then they got together to talk about the threat of power growing among the Democratic Party. And so they went through the issues to see if there was an issue that they thought would really bring the masses to a position that could be used among conservatives to stop the progressive momentum in the country. And they decided on abortion. And that's when you first begin to hear popularly in political circles the issue of abortion. So I think it's worth researching to see, I mean, just those names, Ronald Reagan and Pat Robertson, and who are some of the others of that era.
Good old Jerry Falwell.
Jerry Falwell, right, right. But this article said that it was a very specific, intentional going through the issues to see what one issue could bring the conservative mind to an agreement to strengthen the conservative movement in this country. I thought that was quite interesting. All right, any other comments? Then we will return to question 3 of one marginalized group that comes to mind when we consider the bans and restrictions on women's health care. And then Elwood, we will return to you with gratitude for correcting my error.
Not a problem. I suppose my answer, ties into the last question a bit, in that, this tactic that's being used is sort of a divide and conquer tactic. It was done with the Southern strategy that tried to make white people continue to be afraid of Black people. This strategy of dividing, good people don't have abortions, but bad people do, and you don't want to be like those bad people, is just another way of dividing us. So my answer, what marginalized group comes to mind, is actually the majority of people. If we go down this route to what feels to me like a theocracy, where narrow theological rules become more and more extreme and are used as a way of controlling the public for mostly political purposes, then it marginalizes the majority. Even if we don't call it a theocracy, you count women and people who don't fit neatly into the binary gender descriptions of male or female, and people of color and people who just don't conform to narrow patriarchal standards. That's most of us. There's no question. We come from a history where older, wealthier, mostly white men have had the privilege of making rules that supposedly apply to everybody. And we've wound up with an abusive system, not a supportive one. The politics are all too often the politics of fear these days.
That's right.
Be afraid and be suspicious of everybody and everything, including the government now. All with a claim somehow God is behind the rules. I think the idea of abortion as a political issue is really a political ploy. And it puts all of us at risk.
That's interesting. The marginalized group is the majority of us. All right, let's move to Lauren. Can you name a marginalized group that your heart embraces in relation to reproductive justice?
Sure. Before I answer that question, though, I want to comment on the earlier question about when did this become such a hotbed political issue? And if nothing else, doesn't it show how polarized we are in our country right now? As we think about the issue of abortion, but also so many other issues. And to Elwood's point about how this affects the majority of Americans support Roe v. Wade and support legal access to abortion. And so it was interesting when Senate Bill 8 came through in Texas, which is the vigilante bill, that says that not only is it illegal to have an abortion at so many weeks, but if you aid and abet anybody in their abortion, that you are also held liable. And so it's citizens patrolling citizens. Right. And all that to say that, like, conservative news networks, in particular Fox, they were not even reporting on this bill at all, because they knew that even their super conservative constituents, again, the majority supports reproductive health care. So I continue to find that so so fascinating, that it's become so controlled and so politicized.
Right.
To
And
that extent, yeah, go ahead.
well, the Texas law turns neighbor against neighbor. The Texas
Yes.
law just is anti-conscience, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Unitarian, anti-everything. And because all of the faith communities love thy neighbor, care for thy neighbor. We're one human family, and the Texas bill says, no, we're not. You be leery of what your neighbor is doing. And if you think she might be having an abortion, report it, or you will be fined or go to jail. Yeah, it's a hefty bill, and there are legislators in Kentucky that are writing a Kentucky law to imitate the Texas law.
Yeah, it's scary.
Beware.
Yeah, those cat bills are going to pop up all around the country, I'm afraid.
So do you have one group that is close to your heart?
I do. I would name people in rural parts of our country who are outside city limits, who don't have health centers close by, who have to travel in order to seek abortion care or repro rights or repro justice care. And they, with mandatory waiting periods and mandatory ultrasounds and all of the requirements in legislation that they build around abortion care that make it even that much harder for patients to access the care that they need, it really limits and harms in critical ways those in rural areas.
Thank you. Sharon Cantor Hortis.
I really agree with what everyone else has been saying. But I just keep coming back to this idea that if somebody is wealthy and privileged enough, they're going to get around this, and they have been getting around it. And the people who are out there trumpeting, you know, pro-life and save the babies, very often are the same people who have quiet, you know, arrangements behind the scenes for their wives and girlfriends and mistresses and et cetera, et cetera. So anybody who is not going to be able to benefit from that sort of work around these laws, you know, God forbid they are created, or even worse, access to reproductive health care. Those are the people that are going to really be the victims. And I think that the children who were born whose parents just don't have the bandwidth, don't have the financial ability to take care of them, are the ones that are going to suffer. Children brought into the world that don't have the support. It's just going to create, you know, generations of poverty and mental health issues, and unfortunately maybe crime. It's nothing good to come out of it.
Thank you, Sharon. And Mark, can
I
you
think
name a group that's close to your heart that is profoundly affected by restrictions?
Teen girls that still live at home.
Yep.
I think of them because sometimes their parents are not supportive. And these bills make it even more difficult for them to access any kind of information or help, I think.
Right.
And they're ones I feel so sad for, among the others.
All right, then I open it to the rest of us. Can you name a marginalized group that is affected by the increased restrictions and bans on women's health care? We've mentioned teen girls. We've mentioned the majority of people who are outside the power brokers. Mark very briefly hit upon those with mental health issues. In my own family, my granddaughter-in-law chose, I think wisely, to have an abortion when she became pregnant with a third pregnancy and already has 2 children with chromosome deficiencies. And she just did not feel that emotionally she could accept one more. She had two under the age of 2. And so I think mental health, emotional health, people with emotional issues or mental health issues are profoundly affected by restrictions on healthcare. Anyone else?
I think, and our panelists have been really good in saying kind of like pregnant people, non-binary and trans individuals as well are often
Yes.
overlooked in this conversation about accessing healthcare, period. But particularly when it comes to reproductive healthcare, I think it's certainly a marginalized demographic.
One of our presenters hit persons who are trans hard, that they are really affected by restrictions on health.
I think this is a different sort of take to the question, but I think the other group that is, it's not marginalized, but I think the other group that is hurt by this is the Christian community, broadly speaking. I think when we allow this issue to sort of define who we are, we're not sending out the message, number one, that Christ, as so many of the panelists have said, wanted us to emphasize, number one. And number two, we're taking a position that is that awful lot of people who need the church don't agree with and don't see themselves being a part of. So I think it's really hurting us more than we fully appreciate.
I'm muted. I appreciate that, David. Thank you. All right, then we have about 20 minutes to have an open discussion. Does anyone have a question to ask?
You might have some in the chat.
Oh, Walter just reminded me I might have one in the chat. No, but David did say that Forbes reports American support for abortion in all or most cases is at 80% earlier this year, only slightly higher than in 1975 when it was 76%. I read last week, I think it was a Pew report, that 65% want to keep abortions legal, and we must not overturn Roe versus Wade. Which
I think we are letting a minority speak loudly and outvoice us. We're being too silent about our objections to what is being done by a minority of people, very conservative minority. And it's very bothersome.
Well, last week, when we had the representatives from Planned Parenthood, one of the questions that they were asked was, what are you optimistic about the future in reproductive justice? And one of the things they pointed out was this polling data that Americans overwhelmingly support reproductive choice, and yet we have laws like what we have in Texas, and we have state after state passing laws that absolutely contradict what we just saw 80% of the American public supports. So we might feel optimistic about this polling, but in reality, it's not getting down to the legislatures. It's not getting to the ballot box. And these aren't even things that are on the ballot. This is just laws passed. So I love to be optimistic. I'm less optimistic because, again, we see state after state falling to these crazy restrictive, and it's infuriating.
Well, we've watched Supreme Court justices appointed specifically because of their stance against Roe.
Right. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
That one issue was the primary concern for the selection of Supreme Court justices?
I'd like to comment. Yeah, I think I'm on.
Yes,
Also,
Patricia.
Yes, I'd like to comment that I believe it's intensified with the pandemic and the amount of time out of school. I think young women today are not hearing discussions that cover these kinds of points in meaningful ways. And I don't believe that our educational systems is doing as good a job of talking about health, including sexual health. And so much that's not being touched, along with book banning and other things. That what I think my point relates to, I think young women in general, regardless of socioeconomic level, and I would say those who are born female who could become pregnant. Okay, thinking of teens, that this is a large swath of people of different sexual persuasions, but they don't hear straightforward factual information and values-based information to the extent that even my kids did, who now are in middle age. I mean, I'm much older, so I mean, I didn't grow up with any of it being okay to be discussed in any way. And like other
Right.
women in my generation, we've watched many, many difficult things happen to many people and lack of real choice. But I really do worry about today's young women, that they're not hearing a talk like this, where they could say, oh, okay, there really are legitimate views here. We had the young people speak in the last, I didn't come to that last program, but I went back and looked it up.
Oh, good.
And, oh yes, there were very forthright discussions, but that's not what our young people are hearing.
That's a beautiful segue into my last question, which is for all of us. And that is, how can we continue this conversation among the people in the Louisville area? People that are not hearing conversations on reproductive justice. We've heard 4 weeks of conversation. We've had 4 weeks of conversation about reproductive justice. And how can we carry this conversation to other parts of Louisville?
Well, it will be a conversation, in the news because of the election issue coming November. The amendment that's been proposed to the Kentucky Constitution to make sure that no right to abortion can be found in the Kentucky Constitution and no right to funding for abortions. There will be people out campaigning to get out the vote for that. I think it's incumbent upon the rest of us to have the conversations to say that this is just another get out the vote issue, that it shouldn't be on the ballot. Kentucky has already got a trigger law that would make abortions illegal if and when Roe is overturned. But more important, the proposal reveals the narrowness of those who oppose or who want abortion to be illegal. There's no exception contemplated for rape, incest, the health of the mother, or anything else. It is an absolute blanket prohibition that there is no right under the Kentucky Constitution and its Bill of Rights for anyone to have an abortion.
Is everyone aware of the amendment that is on the books? We will be voting in November. Everybody in the state will be voting in November for an amendment to the Constitution that says that there can be no right to an abortion in Kentucky and no rights to funding an abortion in Kentucky.
Right, House Bill 91.
House Bill 91.
So is the ballot initiative, and you need to vote no, not and again, that'll be another, that's important to have those conversations whenever you have a ballot initiative, is that many people are confused about whether they vote yes or no on way. And so you have to explain it about with the whole thing. Like, if you don't like this, if you want to keep abortion legal, then you vote no on it.
No.
And so, there'll be, so I think one way to have this, this is one thing to have a conversation about and to bring it up and to make it, because most people do want to keep at least some form of abortion legal. And so, and to have reproductive justice and reproductive services for people. So I think that's the conversation all of us are charged with, to have with our friends, with our families, within our congregations. Some of them will be hard discussions, but I think it's even people that really have strong feelings about abortion may not, about not wanting to see that, they still may think that you should have some avenues. And this is such a blanket of like nothing. It's like going back to the dark ages.
I wanted to comment. I was really struck by Cantor Sharon when she started talking about this is being pushed as a religious issue. And we really are supposed to have separation of church and state. And I'm just wondering, are any of the religious communities, including the Jewish community, doing anything about raising that kind of issue with people?
That's a great question. I spoke this past Saturday morning. The National Council of Jewish Women designated this week to be Reproductive Justice Shabbat, Sabbath. And they sent out a toolkit with all kinds of talking points, all sorts of ideas of discussion questions that you could do within your own community. I think it's just a case. We have people in our community, my particular congregation, who are politically conservative, but I don't think this is one of the issues that they're concerned about. I don't think it's even on their radar. They I'm sure would support a woman's right to choose. So I think I'm guilty of this also. I'm not pushing it enough. I think it's because of this, we want to exercise our religious freedom. We need to make sure that that's not taken away, and that people have dignity and choice and a hope for a better future, and to live by our religious values. We need to be more active in this fight. I don't know about any other particular religions and what their stances are, but I do know that I feel personally that this is something that I think in the last few years on a national level, various liberal Jewish organizations have been more vocal about it.
The National Council of Jewish Women are really energetic right now.
Yes.
In supporting reproductive rights. Yes.
Yes.
And you can Google National Council of Jewish Women, and there's a whole list of information that is available.
There is a small group with the unfortunate acronym of CUJAN, which is the Kentucky Unitarian Universalist Justice Action Network. They're having a meeting Wednesday evening, and the theme will be around the proposed amendment. So, the UU congregations in the state will at least have the opportunity to learn what's going on and to be able to try and plan how we can join with Planned Parenthood and others in opposition. Reverend Cantor, the minister at First Unitarian Church in Dallas, currently is part of the group that's trying to sue Texas for that Texas vigilante law, making the argument that it's a violation of freedom of speech. He, as a minister, is supposed to be able to talk with his congregants about issues like whether to choose an abortion. And as he reads the aiding and abetting language, for him to suggest that an abortion might be an option could make him criminally liable. So he's trying to have the law overturned on that ground. The law is carefully designed in Texas so that there's no way to bring it to court, but there's continuing work that way. And we may have to do that kind of thing elsewhere too, as people try and copy Texas.
And if you click on chat, then you get all the information that has been put into the chat tonight by anybody who typed it in, namely Emma. She's our resource.
Diane, I was going to say too, just in listening to everybody and thinking about what we can do, I think this isn't as much of a action thing, but I think it is really helpful. It is to me anyway, and I would imagine to others, to just keep reminding myself that it is a minority that wants to take things backwards, because they're so vocal, and there's so many issues right now where folks are trying to on the religious right are trying to pass laws based on one version of the Christian faith, let alone not counting even any of the other faiths. But it's really easy to start thinking that that's bigger than it is, because they're obviously well organized and loud. And so just like hearing Sandy asking us to call, it really is kind of empowering just to hear again, the numbers are in our favor and calling does make a difference. Just to keep, almost like a mantra, to keep reminding ourselves of those things, I think is really helpful.
25 calls from your constituency about a particular issue, you're going to listen to what that is saying.
The legislator is going to listen.
Yes, so the point is that these legislators generally don't get that many calls. And the calls that they are going to get are those that are pro life. You might now pro, what do you call it?
That's
Yeah, I
what they
guess they
call it,
call it
pro-life.
pro-life.
That's what they call them.
That's the ones that they're going to get. And the people who really are vocal, that minority, are going to be giving their opinion to the legislators. So if we, in the majority, do not call, then our majority is not heard.
I would like to know, I'm more comfortable doing an email than calling. Does it hold the same weight?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Okay, good.
Because
I can think about what I'm doing. Pardon me?
We've been told that an actual handwritten letter in your own words is the most impactful thing, because they know they're not mass produced. An email isn't as powerful if it's a mass email that you just signed your name to. So putting things into your own words so that, if they bother to check and see that it's you and not your name on a long list, apparently makes a difference.
The clock says 9 o'clock. Does anyone have a final comment? The series is over, and I just want to thank you again for participating. The panelists tonight has been superb.